The prophecy of Isaiah. We've now reached the 13th presentation in this series. This is entitled The Collapse of World Societies. The prophecy of Isaiah. Let's just reflect back on the situation into which Isaiah was speaking at that time. The great empire of Assyria, dominating, expanding, battling with groups around it all the time. Judah, the little patch of red, the tiny group, the people of God, with the threat of Assyria from the north and surrounded by the nations shown in blue there, always a threat to its very existence. And we looked in the last two presentations at some of the nations that were situated round about. And also at Babylonia. Sometimes part of the Empire of Assyria, sometimes breaking away, and eventually it broke away and it took over Assyria. But there was a jockeying for power between Babylonia, Assyria, and the former Empire of Egypt, which was beginning to lose its power. And poor Judah was caught in the crossfire. What were they going to do? And that is the context where Isaiah was speaking. The real question that faced the people and the leadership of the day of Isaiah, what were the people of Judah to do? This tiny nation, this small group of God's people, with the threat of the Assyrian Empire round about, this is what they did do. They tried to form alliances with neighbouring states, including Egypt. Didn't work. They tried to support Babylonia when it rose in power a bit, thinking it would undermine Assyria. Didn't work. They tried to negotiate with Assyria and to get some kind of agreement. Didn't work. They tried to buy Assyria off. They stripped the wealth of Judah, the wealth of the temple, and paid it to Assyria. Didn't work. They tried to fortify Jerusalem and build up its weapons. Well, that stayed things off for a short time, but in the end of the day, didn't work. They were overrun. And we looked at the parallels for today. The people of God, especially the people of God in the West, we're surrounded by threats. In the Middle East, the people of God are surrounded by the permanent threat of Islam and Islamism, seeking to destroy and wipe out every last vestige of the Christian way. In the world of North Korea or China, Christians under enormous threat and pressure, and yet growing in numbers there as they are in the Middle East. Threats are there, but in the West we're faced with the threats of rampant secularism, materialism, humanism, combining in various groups, the nations round about, if you like. The threat of Islam, growing, claiming to grow in numbers greatly, but the growth is entirely biological with bigger families. They're not drawing people to Islam. But they are a threat because they have a policy to take over the West. And what do? We try to negotiate alliances with the groups around about, compromising. One Christian group groups up with another Christian group against a third one. We try to negotiate. It often involves compromise. We try to buy peace from those who threaten, often trying to present that we're doing good things and buy peace from them. But so often, in the past and today, we retreat into our religious ghettos, our religious institutions, our religious buildings. We do our thing and the world just passes us by. Isaiah would say to us today, none of that will work. So smash it up, break it up, look at it again. And what he would say was the same as what he said to Judah. Put your house in order. Here in the West, the people of God, the Christian church, we've got a bad press. A minority of leaders have done dreadful things. The media have made a meal of it. Put our house in order. But it goes right across the board, in every group, in every part of the land, in every nation. The people of God, we're running religious systems. We pretend we're not, but we are. and we're now seen as an irrelevance to society. The real threats, Isaiah would say to us, are within you, within your groups, within yourselves. Get me back into the center and stop playing religious games. We have our religious meetings. We have our religious programs and policies. Isaiah would take us apart. And where's our unity? Why do we point score one group against another? Why do groups keep splitting and arguing? Where is God in all of this? Jesus is the Lord of glory. He brings unity. He brings oneness. Let's get God back in the center. And it starts there. But it moves there. That's the message of Isaiah, the great principles he's declaring for us today. We asked in the last presentation why there are so many chapters devoted to nations. Isaiah couldn't speak to these nations. He was speaking to Judah. And he was saying to them, don't rely on these nations. Don't be frightened of them. The problems don't rest there. They rest within you. And that's why these chapters have been preserved for us today, because they identify principles. Don't try and rip out from them all sorts of celestial timetables and details of the future. That's not the purpose. That's not what Isaiah was saying. That's not the context. He was addressing real people in Judah in about the 9th century, 8th century. He was addressing them on real problems they were facing, and he's showing how God is at work and illustrating God's principles. And they apply today, just as they applied then. That's why this is so important. This is a common view in our society. We think God's on our side, and then we'll win the battles. And if we're losing ground, then God's not on our side. That's a common view. But there's another common view. In our Western cultures today, that's what we're doing. We haven't denied that God exists, or that he is the creator, but we've pushed him to the sidelines. And we've depended on other things. These are our gods. Now we humans are very clever, and we can fix a lot of things. Technological fix. History shows how good we are at it. God made us that way. We're depending on our wealth. You see it all around. The dominance of money, the dominance of security, the dominance of possession, the dominance of property, the dominance of cars, the dominance of fine clothes and jewelry. Wealth, money, and corruption is coming out of it. And we build up our armed forces thinking that we can defend ourselves, we can look after ourselves, we can look after number one by sheer brute force. That's a Western way of thinking. But see, these things have consequences. If we think that way, then we've got that simplistic view. And there were people in Judah at that time that thought, and it was very apparent in the days of Isaiah's successor, Jeremiah, we're the people of God. God won't let us down. He'll rescue us. Doesn't matter what we do. We are a select chosen few. We're the in group. And there's still that view right across the nations today. Winning means a justification of what we believe in. We've got it right because we've won. Might is right. But the other common view has also got consequences. You see, we think we can fix things in our own strength by our own abilities. We want to do it our way, and sooner or later, your way conflicts with someone else's way, at a personal level, in a community level, in a family, in a nation. And you can see it in the nations of the West today. Almost pitched battles between the extreme right and the extreme left, for example. And between nations is perhaps where it's most evident. For a long time in the West we thought capitalism held the answer. That was our God. It would win, and communism, their God, would be defeated. That's still there today, but perhaps not quite so upfront. But it's also there, this viewpoint, very, very strongly and growing in Islam. Because Islam teaches in the Quran that Islam is God's religion. It also teaches that God only loves Muslims, doesn't love others. We're right. We've got the answer. We're supreme. We can put others down. We can force them into joining us. The supremacy culture. And you see that worked out in tragic detail in many Islamic states today. But it's growing in the West. Now, most Muslims pay lip service to it. Most Muslims are wonderful and good people, as most people are. But in the theology and in the leadership, that dominates, and it will dominate, and it will take over. But what about the other side? If you think about it, that's the source of all competition and conflict. And we have overemphasized competition. And if someone wins, someone else loses. And the person who loses may resent bitterly. And you've got the seeds of conflict sown. That is coming in the societies of the West and growing today. And eventually it will explode. These are the kind of issues that Isaiah is addressing and saying these are not the right ways to think. These are not the way that God thinks. God works on a totally different scale, to a totally different kind of agenda. It's much, much bigger. And none of these pictures are adequate or good. God opposes our pride, your pride and mine, the pride of leaders and nations and political systems and religious systems that all think they're superior or supreme. Because that kind of pride makes us independent of Him. Now, why does God want us to depend on Him? Because of this simple, practical and loving reason. Because when we start to live in relation to Him, when we start to depend on Him, when we start to bring Him into the center of practical living, then we begin to have the possibility of reaching our full potential and having great lives. And there's harmony and unity. And if we don't, sooner or later, the innocent will suffer. People will get hurt. When we go our own way, by our own selfish pride, by our own self-centeredness and thinking we have the answers, there brings conflict sooner or later. And many, many people suffer. God doesn't want that. He wants the best for us. God is love. And He knows that the best for us is when we live our lives in line with the way He made us. And He can show us that way if we'll just listen. He pictured the ideal in chapter 2. And later on in this series we'll look at chapter 58, because He pictures the way when this works out, things start to happen. Benefits come to all those round about. When we get God back at the center, not only is the wonderful ideal lifestyle beginning to emerge, but we're getting a picture of how others round about are getting the benefits. That's God's agenda, because God is love. Now we're going to look at chapter 24 and just into chapter 25. The picture is of a collapse of world societies. Now a word is used again and again and again. Sometimes it's translated earth, sometimes land, and there may be variations across biblical translations. And sometimes it's as a pronoun. But about 17 times there, the word is actually used. And the word is used in the sense of a land or a nation. So if you like, it's the kind of nation as defined by its territory and its property. and what it is, where it is, and what it owns. Because the word earth and land can have multiple meanings, but that's what the original word, that's the sense it carries. Just carry that in mind. We're going to look at verses 1 to 6. See, the Lord is going to lay waste the earth and devastate it. That's the word earth, land, the people, territory owned by nations. He will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. It'll be the same for priest as for people, for the master as for the servant, for the mistress as for her servant, for seller as for buyer, for borrower as for lender, for debtor as for creditor. The earth will be completely laid waste and totally plundered. The Lord has spoken this word. Wow! When you hear that, it knocks you back and says, what on earth is Isaiah saying? Does God do that kind of thing? You see, when societies rebel against God, when we go on and persistently push God to the edge, or we create a God in our own image as religions do, there comes a time when the whole of society falls apart. It's a spiritual principle. It comes as night follows day. Isaiah pictures it as God doing it. That's just his way of picturing it, and that's an Old Testament way of seeing it. What's actually being pictured here is an inevitability. It's an inevitable consequence if societies, for a period of time, push God out, push him to the edge, bring up other gods, false religions, false ideas, false political stances, and make them gods, gods of humanism or materialism or selfishness or whatever. The society, sooner or later, implodes. It falls apart. And it hits everyone in society from top to bottom. We all suffer. And only a remnant actually survive. And Isaiah is saying we don't want that. Here's how to avoid it. You see, when we try to do things our way, whether our way is imposing our religion on other groups, which is very much the Islamic mindset, or the communist mindset. But it can happen at any level, in any way, between any nations, our way, our political insight, our religious insight, or even our selfish way. It tends to generate conflict sooner or later. Because we're not thinking of other people, we're thinking of ourselves. And society just falls apart. And the society, which is why the word that's used for earth or land is used, it affects the actual territory, the land, the people. Everything is affected. And you can see that happening in parts of the world today. And the innocent suffer horrendously. God doesn't want that. And I say Isaiah's warning the people of Judah, and it's a warning that gives us a principle that applies today. Let's look at the second half of this section. The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish with the earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse consumes the earth. Its people must bear their guilt. Therefore, earth's inhabitants are burned up and very few are left. Isaiah is picturing the inevitable consequences. Therefore, let's fade that out and just look at this for a moment. The words are interesting. The earth is defiled. It's a very, very strong word. You could translate it polluted. What a mess we have made of our societies. Quite apart from the mess we've made of our environment. Disobeyed. The word there means that we've chosen to go the wrong way. It's your choice. It's my choice. Community's choice. Nation's choices. We've chosen to go the wrong way. God is the best way, which gives us our richest and fullest life possible. We've chosen not to follow it. It's interesting that word violated has got the idea of being altered. And what we see in the West today is we're creating a new morality. We're altering God's ways. Now you see it very vividly in the attitudes towards human sexuality, where a new morality is being created and being imposed, and it's generating conflict because we're not going God's way. But you can see it in all kinds of areas of life, where a new kind of morality, and indeed it's in a very deep, subtle form right across Western cultures, what is right is being decided by majority opinions, or in some cases by opinions of those who have power in this society. Isaiah was way ahead of his time. Broken the everlasting covenant. We've just set aside God's ways. God's ways were there because they're the best way that gives us the richest and fullest style of living. Now the word curse looks like it's come from a kind of medieval thought form. The word actually means an oath. And the word is used in the sense, it's difficult to translate, but curse perhaps gives a wrong impression. A divine principle is perhaps the nearest to it. There is a divine principle built into the way society has been designed by God, by the way we human beings have been designed, by the purposes of God, for the benefit of us, not to give us burdens, not to make life horrendous, but to make life rich and full. Think of all that Jesus said when he said, I've come to bring your life to the full. Not a rule book, not restrictions, do this, don't do that, do the other. It's a positive, wholesome way of living, a divine principle. But the principle is if we don't go that way, there are consequences. As all your decisions and my decisions in life have consequences, so it happens at the societal level. You see, there are fundamental spiritual principles that God has built into the way he has created us. And when we live in line with the way he's created us, it works. It's like any piece of machinery. When it's employed and used in line with the way the maker, whoever's designed it, and the purposes they designed it for, it will work. But when it doesn't, all things sooner or later fall apart. And that's what's happening in the West. There's a fragmentation of social structure. Political groups are at each other's throats. They're not prepared to compromise, agree, discuss, or talk even. You find it across religions. You find it across religious groups within a religion. We can point the finger at all the battles that have gone on between religious groups within Christianity, where one group thinks they've got it right, and they're just waiting for all the other groups to capitulate and rejoin them. Or one group thinks they've got right and then just laughs at all the other groups in a city. They've got it wrong. But you can see it vividly also in Shia Islam against Sunni Islam, with the Sufi Islam caught in the middle. Social structures fall apart. Innocent people get damaged, and indeed innocent people get killed and suffered horrendously. That's what Isaiah is picturing. If we go this way, this is what Isaiah is saying to his people. If you go this way, if you push God to the side, if you don't take him serious, don't get him back into the frame and listen to what he said, it's not a question of him jumping and dropping on us like a ton of bricks, but it is an inevitable consequence. It's self-inflicted suffering. The consequences we've brought upon ourselves. And a lot of people will suffer. The earth's inhabitants are burned up, is the way Isaiah puts it. And only a few will survive. That's the way we're going in our world today. And there are inevitable consequences that are going to happen. I'm going to select from these verses. The ruined city lies desolate, the entrance to every house is barred, in the streets they cry out for wine. All joy turns to gloom, all joyful sounds are banished from the earth. The city is left in ruins, its gate is battered to pieces. They raise their voices, they shout for joy from the west, they acclaim the Lord's majesty. Therefore in the east give glory to the Lord, exalt the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, in the islands of the sea. From the ends of the earth we hear singing, glory to the righteous one. It's a strange combination of two paragraphs of poetry there. But interpreted in the context of when Isaiah was saying this, it makes immediate sense. Let's look at that. Now the word city there is used in the sense of organized humanity in a rebellion against God. In those days, what was called a city, it would be called just a big village or a town today, it organized itself, and in that time it was organized in rebellion against God. If you're like a society of meaninglessness or a city of chaos, that's what's going to happen. Go that way, the consequences are inevitable. But the second half, how come you've got this? Now if you look at the first little bit of the poetry there, they raise their voices. In the original, it really means this: there are those who raise their voices. It's the they that's deeply emphasized in the Hebrew. And Isaiah was speaking of a time when Assyria had declined a little bit, and the people of Judah were kind of wiping their brow and saying, we're off the hook, all is well, we've been rescued, God's seen us through. And that happened several times. Premature celebration, because Assyria regrouped, and under new leaders they gained power, often more power. For a time the oppressive human evil was pushed down or overthrown a bit, but there was worse to come. Oh, sadly I see this in Christian groups today. There's a little bit of a breakthrough, a bit of encouragement. Something works a bit better. And we're prematurely celebrating, not realizing that worse is going to come, because we have not put our house in order. As groups, as communities, as nations, as the people of God. Premature celebration. Now if you look at the second half, you can see why that interpretation is right. Because Isaiah comes straight in and said, but I said, Isaiah could see it, I waste away, woe to me, the treacherous betray. With treachery, the treacherous betray. A lot of emphasis of words there. And he goes on to say to the people, terror and pit and snare await you, people of the earth. Whoever flees at the sound of terror will fall into a pit. Whoever climbs out of the pit will be caught in a snare. The floodgates of the heavens are opened, the foundations of the earth shake. Isaiah could see that this celebration was premature. And if you look at the history, and some of the books in the Bible will give pictures of this, you see these moments of premature celebration. And the prophet was saying, wait a minute. Yes, you've got a bit of a break here, a bit of time, but the time is to put your house in order. But the leadership didn't do it. And worse came. It was a temporary reprieve. Let's not be conned and fooled today. There's things that we've got to do. Where is God? We run our programs and we ask God to rubber stamp them. We run our religious meetings and our religious systems in our way, often criticizing those who do it differently. Where is the love? Where is the unity? We're more interested in running our systems and going out and helping those within our groups and outside our groups where there is deep need. Now I speak in general terms. There are wonderful Christian groups across the West who are breaking out from this thought form and doing wonderful things, where within the group there is great unity and great love, and there's great caring for their communities round about. But the church in general is characterized by running a religious system, or multiple systems depending on the group. And that's the way the world sees it, that's the way the media sees it, because that's the way it often is. And very often people are in positions seeking power. And when things get better for a short time, Isaiah is saying, don't celebrate. It's premature. There's worse to come because you haven't put your house in order. And he goes on, in that day the Lord will punish the powers in the heavens above and the kings on the earth below. They'll be herded together like prisoners bound in a dungeon. They'll be shut up in prison, will be punished after many days. The moon will be dismayed, the sun ashamed. For the Lord Almighty will reign on Mount Zion in Jerusalem and before its elders with great glory. Now we've got to watch that phrase, in the day. That day, we've spoken about this before. It does not mean that we're speaking about end times here. The phrase is an ordinary Hebrew phrase, and it just means there comes a point in time when God intervenes. Now, of course, that will happen in end times, but that's not what Isaiah is talking about. He's talking to real people in Jerusalem, in Judah, many, many centuries ago. And it addresses real issues that they were facing, with the potential onslaught of Assyria hovering over them all the time. That's what he's saying. God will intervene. Now this introduces a very deep thought. There is a spiritual realm led by Satan, with evil spiritual angels. New Testament calls them demons, but that's also mentioned in the Old Testament too. They're causing problems, but they can only cause problems to the extent to which we human beings allow them to cause problems. And when we choose not to go God's way, when we choose to do it our way, we potentially open the door for their activities. That's what Isaiah is saying. There's a spiritual realm and a human realm involved in this, and together they're going to face consequences when God intervenes. Now the word for moon and sun there literally is the white one or the hot one. This may be a reference to the fact that many of the nations around about were worshipping the sun or the moon. Laughable, but it still happens today. People worship things, the creation, rather than the creator. But it's poetic language. In other words, the whole source of light, everything in the whole world will be affected. Life will be, and society, communities, cultures will be totally messed up. But out of that messing up, something good will happen. Now that's not God using something bad to create something good. That's unethical and immoral, and God never does that. All of this happens simply because of the consequences, the inevitable consequences. If we thumb our noses at God, push him to the side, run our religious systems, or pretend he doesn't matter, there are consequences. Society falls apart at every level. But a remnant do survive, and the picture at the end is that God can assume his rightful place. It happened with Judah. The inevitable consequences, because they didn't listen to Isaiah and they didn't listen to Jeremiah, the inevitable consequences happened. They were overrun. Many of them were deported. Jerusalem was flattened and burnt to the ground. The temple was destroyed. But out of that, the descendants of that, the penny began to drop. They learned their lesson. Not imposed by God, it's just the inevitable consequences of the behavior of their ancestors. Now there's real celebration, because the thing now is really solved. And when we go into chapter 25, I'm just going to start this and then pick it up in the next presentation, the real celebration starts to happen. Look at the first 5 verses. Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you and praise your name. For in perfect faithfulness you have done wonderful things, things planned long ago. You have made the city a heap of rubble, the fortified town a ruin, the foreigner's stronghold a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore strong peoples will honor you. Cities of ruthless nations will revere you. You've been a refuge for the poor, a refuge for the needy in their distress, a shelter from the storm, and a shade from the heat. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm driving against a wall, and like the heat of the desert. You silence the uproar of foreigners as heat is reduced by the shadow of a cloud. So the song of the ruthless is stilled. This is the genuine celebration. And Isaiah is able to join in it. Look at the first little bit of it. You, my, I, you. It's personal. It's not a vague thing about God at a distance. And the appreciation that God is utterly reliable. He set up principles, but we take the decisions and we live with the consequences of our decisions. You take decisions, you live with the consequences of your decisions. It goes by spiritual principles that God has set in place. These principles are for your benefit and mine. Flout them, there are consequences. And that word wonderful carries and captures the idea of the supernatural. Oh, why do some Christian groups today pretend that God doesn't work in the supernatural? If God is God and God is the universe, God is the God of miracles. And let's look at the evidence throughout the world today and we can see God's hand in wonderful ways, miraculous ways, intervening and helping and blessing those who turn to Him. God has a long-term purpose. You take the decisions, as do I, as to whether we come into line with that long-term purpose. But the long-term purpose is still there. There are spiritual principles by which God has created us and created this world in which we live. Pictures of a walled city, a fortified town. They are pictures, this is all poetry, representing the works of human pride and oppression. If you like, the centers of power trying to crush the people of God. Now they've been wiped out. In due time, Assyria was wiped out by Babylonia. Babylonia was in some ways even worse. In due time, Babylonia was wiped out by the Medio-Persian Empire. It had a different policy and allowed religious freedom. In due time, the Medio-Persian Empire was taken over by the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. And the people of God suffered at the hands of the Romans horrendously because they chose not to put their house in order when Jesus came. And Jesus prophesied and predicted that if they didn't, then the whole land would be overrun. The temple would be destroyed right to the ground. And it was in AD 70. It was the inevitable consequence. The people of Judah then brought it on themselves because they revolted against Rome, thinking that they had all the power. They were deluded. And the Romans destroyed them, and there was horrendous suffering. See, God has a purpose. Where's the Roman Empire today? And yet the people of God, followers of Jesus, grow in numbers. And they're growing in numbers rapidly in most parts of the world. It is not true to say that Islam is the fastest growing religion. You can fiddle statistics to make that point. Any growth in Islam which is considerable is because of bigger families. Islam is not reaching out. There are some who are forced into it, but that's all. But the way of Jesus is growing naturally as people live for Jesus, often sacrificially, suffering greatly, and others are being drawn to Jesus, and the people of God are growing, and the empires of this world are disappearing. Because God's in the business of providing for you and me, if we seek His ways. God only wants the best for all humanity. He doesn't have favourites. But if we choose not to go His way, then we choose to opt out of His blessings. And that's what He wants. Therefore, strong peoples will honour you. Cities of ruthless nations will revere you. It's an interesting observation that the gospel of Jesus Christ spread rapidly in that part of the world that was the central part of the old Assyrian Empire, which had long gone. But the people there responded to the teaching of Jesus, and almost all the communities came to Jesus in the early centuries following His life, death, and resurrection. Now they've been wiped out by Islam, and the last wiping out is going on sadly today in front of our eyes, and we in the West in the Christian church are doing very little about it. But those who stand against God's ways, they're running against God's principles of life, and eventually they will go. It's a spiritual law, if you like. The seeds of their own destruction are within their own way of doing things. That's the picture we've got. There's a wonderful picture which runs throughout the Bible, and it's unique to the Bible. God, the Lord of glory, the Almighty Creator, who's way beyond us in every possible thought, is also the God who wants to know us, who looks after us, the refuge for the poor, a refuge for the needy, a shelter from the storm, a shade from the heat. That's the God of the Lord Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ came to make known the God of the universe and make Him real to you and to me and to the peoples of the world at a personal level, so that lives could be transformed, communities could be transformed, nations could be transformed, and life could be lived to the full the way God intended it. What a beautiful picture. And Isaiah, what a magnificent insight he's gained into the ways of God Himself. That's part of the prophecy of Isaiah. In the next presentation, we're going to go on in chapter 25 and look further at the celebrating of God's intervention.